Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, here in the middle of good old Iowa, between the confluence of two rivers, here in Des Moines on Iowa Catholic Radio. So wonderful to have you with us. You probably know me as the morning show host on the Catholic Morning Show on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, what might other folks know you from?
I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College right there in downtown Des Moines, so holding down the fort when it comes to our science, history, and English classes.
We have been doing this for a while, folks, and it's so wonderful to have you with us here on The Uncommon Good. Catholic social teaching, the common good, all sorts of wonderful things that we're glad that you get to join us to talk about here on the weekend. We want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients, here again in Des Moines, Imogene Ingredients. But I like to think of it that if you have a wonderful livestock that you want to have shiny coats and just you look in their eyes and you go, that livestock animal, they're a happy animal, beaming out radiance. I hope our show does something similar for the souls of everybody who encounter it over the weekend.
Yeah, I was out in rural Iowa this past week and seeing some of the cattle and things out there, so my mind naturally turned to Imogene Ingredients. Certainly grateful they underwrite the show. So
thank you again, Imogene Ingredients. You make all of this possible, and for all of the people who listen to The Uncommon Good and happen to need, cattle feed, Imogene Ingredients. I think you can take that look at that at imogeneingredients.com. But we are rolling along with our Religion and Technology series, and then in the sub-series, of course, Vatican II Documents. We're going to do two today.
Yeah, we want to start with Nostra aetate, which is the declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions,
and then
the decree on ecumenism.
So you're going to want to make sure to stick around. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. And thanks again to Imogene Ingredients for making the show possible. But we are rolling along with our Religion and Technology series, our consideration. And then in the sub-series, of course, Vatican II Documents. We're going to do two today. We're going to set a hard and fast boundary, but I think we can do it. They're two shorter ones. Can you tell the good folks which are the two documents that we're going to be doing?
Well, we want to start with Nostra aetate, which is the declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions. So this one really looking at Catholicism and other religions. But that bleeds into, or like we can relate it also to the decree on ecumenism. That one is more of a mouthful, Unitatis redintegratio, which is the restoration of unity.
Yeah. I think that especially the idea of unity that we see with our current Pope, Pope Leo XIV, talking about it in many settings. So the idea of the unity of Christians and what that might mean, it will be interesting to consider that, what we often mean about it now. So, for instance, Pope Leo XIV very directly talking about a reunification of the Easter date in common, for instance, and what those documents mean there. But we'll start with the decree or the Constitution. Declaration on other religions. So to immediately think about this in terms of the religion and technology bit, then I'll throw it over to you to be our pro who can give the context and everything like this. It's just a fact, Bud, that the idea of talking about Catholicism's place in the world and in relation to other religions, I think the most people ever on earth, in a way that is incapable of being understood, around the 60s would literally be able to see various liturgical practices of other religions. Mm-hmm. And that's really hard for us to imagine. Of course, there's like accounts of other religions, but to read the account of a liturgical life or the sort of what people look like or the practices that they did, to read up on a religion is completely different than seeing it. And so I'm not acting like by the time the Vatican II Council was around, everybody had watched a documentary on Hinduism or something like this. But the capacity for the world to see other religions do liturgical practices, I just want to start this out and say this is something we all take for granted, but had to have been a massive deal for, especially their, being princes of the church, they're all religious scholars anyway. And I'm sure that they had, quote unquote, the capacity to see what it would look like in a way that's just assumed by us now.
No, I think that's right. There's certainly cultural factors that are very much in the background here. And one of them, you're right, Bo, is I think previous to the 20th century, the majority of cultures were very homogeneous. And so you have new forms of transportation, new forms of media, and it's much more likely for, say, an American in a large city to know, personally from work or wherever, someone who practices another faith. Getting into the commentary on Nostra aetate, this is one of those where you've mentioned Marshall McLuhan a lot of times on the show, and this idea of ground and figure. Mm-hmm. When the ground shifts, the content that we've been talking about all of a sudden looks a lot different. Yep. This is especially the case with Nostra aetate, because reading this document today, there's a real contrast between us receiving it and reading it with how it came about. And what I have in mind is teaching this to undergraduates, for instance. This is probably the most innocuous of the Vatican II documents. If you teach Nostra aetate today on other religions, college students hear this and they kind of shrug their shoulders.
Right.
This was actually arguably the most controversial document of the council. So the background, how this got off the ground, is the church, in the wake of the Shoah, the Holocaust, the bishops there felt like it was absolutely necessary to say something about the church's relationship to the Jewish people. It was psychologically bracing for Christians in Europe to consider the fact that these horrific events had taken place on their soil. Mm-hmm. Of course, Christianity's relationship to the Jewish people has this kind of circuitous path throughout history with, unfortunate sort of circumstances and things in certain parts of history. But, the fact that the Third Reich, which of course was not a Christian government, had targeted Jews and killed many Jews in kind of like the heart of Christian Europe, was really difficult to sort of process. And so at Vatican II, the bishops say they have to say something about this. But as discussion of the document starts to get underway, you have to think about another historical factor. Bishops in the Middle East who are pastoring souls in lands in and around Israel, which was founded in 1948, they are concerned about how this is going to be received on the ground and the political implications it will have for the conflicts in that part of the world. And so eventually the bishops come to a point where they want to embed what's being said about the Jewish people in a document that treats non-Christian religions more generally. And the idea here is not to water down what's being said, but to kind of broaden the perspective and to situate it so that it's not just focusing solely on something that's, frankly, at the time of the council, like a very hot issue.
Well, I think that's an interesting thing to bring up, man, is that something can look the most innocuous because you go, oh, yeah, like who in 2025 even, I mean, that's not true. There's people on the internet who say all sorts of stuff, but if you're talking about it in a sort of majority way, there's so many people that this would be the least likely thing for them to even note upon. And in some ways, it even sort of tries to aim for a sort of vanilla language about it. I'm not even being rude, right? That's sort of the rhetorical tact that it takes. But I'm with you that if you want to talk about a document at the time that still has long intertwining threads into political situations here and now. So, I mean, I don't think we're bringing up anything outside of people's knowledge, but to think about how much the state of Israel, how that relates to, of course, Palestinians in general, but to think about Christians in the Holy Land, or to think about Christians in the Middle East and their waning populations due to like war and strife, all of which only have gotten worse since Vatican II. I'm not saying in any sort of silly way that this document started it or had some sort of like innocuous flavor. What I'm agreeing with you, though, is this was trying to be written and strike, like a perfect note, right? It's like a gymnastics routine that's trying to land the routine perfectly in a very volatile situation. The volatility thereof shown by not only what occurred in World War II and what all that they were still dealing with, a few decades after and by the way, in the 60s, uncovering more and more of the full extent of the crimes, and those becoming even more. Speaking of the media, right? It's the 60s where we get the first big worldwide documentaries of the Nazi atrocities, really. At the same time that the situation in the Middle East, I mean, again, not to be rude, I don't think you can say there's a decade that things haven't spiraled more out of control. Maybe like some of the Camp David Accords in the 90s or things like this, but like the whole region where there has been so much interreligious dialogue has been massive. And then, you know, we can get into this with other world religions, but it's not like the Eastern religions are exempt from this real world on the ground difficulty. One only has to think about, of course, Islam and Hinduism in India, but then, of course, Hindu ultranationalism as it's come up recently, the Christians suffering there, Nigeria, Myanmar, like we can go on and on.
Right. Yeah, so that's one sort of like strand of interpretation of this document. And, of course, Bo, on last week's show, we talked about what Gaudium et Spes said about just war. And after the founding of the nation-state of Israel, the Catholic Church, of course, at times has had things to say about like particular conflicts. The bishops in the Middle East were concerned that it was going to make their lives more challenging in the sense that like if the document swayed and like if it leaned in the direction of appearing to choose a side in a particular conflict, like politically that was fraught. Mm-hmm. Since the time that the document was promulgated, there have been other sort of like interpretive clashes that have gotten underway. I'm going to push back against some like traditionalist Catholics who, when they read Nostra aetate, they say this is sort of like indifferentism, while the church kind of falling into this sort of like indifferentism, or sort of like papering over the important differences between religion. I don't know. We can say more about what Nostra aetate says about like specific religious or faith traditions, but the start of the document, to me, it's really in line with what some theologians had said at times in the past. And so it does start with this kind of affirmation of a kind of longing within human beings to find meaning and purpose. And then the document affirms that like that has an ultimate like transcendental orientation. When I say transcendental orientation, I just mean like it's saying like that can only be fulfilled like in a supernatural encounter with God, right? Yeah. But sometimes like philosophers or practitioners of other faiths will use like other categories to kind of like describe or to stumble towards that. Really, the like what folks see as like the fundamental or foundational statement of the document is that the church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in other religions. Now, in that same paragraph, it immediately goes on to affirm that the church is duty bound to proclaim without fail that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, in whom people find the fullness of their religious life. And so like it quickly kind of like brackets off or like denies that the first affirmation needs to lead to a sort of indifferentism. All that being said, I know why this document has kicked up dust, because I already sort of gestured towards the historical past. To me, when Nostra aetate is talking about the church rejects nothing of what is true in other faiths, my mind immediately goes to someone like St. Justin Martyr, who talks about like seeds of truth and other philosophies. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was engaging like Islamic philosophers. In Scripture itself, we've talked on the show, St. Paul at the Areopagus, where he goes to pagans and says, like, the statue that you built, it actually had, like, I'm going to show you what it's really pointing towards.
The plundering of Egyptian gold by the patristics.
All the way down the line. But it did shake things up at the time, and since then has continued to be debated, because I do think prior to this, like when you talk about the decades and centuries immediately before Vatican II, that most often when the church talked about other faiths, the key was more on the lack that was there and the need for, those outside the church to convert and to recognize Christ as Lord. And so, I mean, I don't want to downplay the fact that like there is sort of like a different style or direction that's going on in this document if you contrast it with like sort of papal and magisterial statements from the 19th century.
Yeah, and I go back to this is a sort of way in which there's some key misunderstandings because of the cultural context that was active in 1965 up to now compared to how the church used to speak. So on one hand, it's certainly the case, Bud, that when we in any sort of modern, so let's just say modernity, starting with like early modernity in the 1500s. Okay, say the last 500 years. When anybody Christian in that world reads the church fathers talking about the pagans, paganism's not a live option. So I think we're prone to act like when the patristics talk about the pagans, that they're just talking about like books they've read and ideas they're stealing. They forget, right, that no, I mean, like Justin Martyr, case in point, big time, but up through the majority of the patristic era, they're talking about like people who are still attending pagan worship services. Right. And so when they say that there's philosophy worth stealing from, plundering the Egyptian gold, plundering the pagans with their philosophy, they're talking about people who think that philosophy and then go like sacrifice to Artemis and, you know, things like this, right? And so it is potentially more scandalous than we realize, maybe, because it's easy to read about the pagan, especially the Grecian Hellenistic past, and go, oh yeah, well, they were just stealing good ideas from classical antiquity, no big deal. But it is a big deal. I mean, they were like, you know, they had a surgeon's scalpel trying to say, these are the aspects of the pagans. You know, your friends who go and sacrifice to idols. All of that's wrong, but these ideas are worth keeping, and we should adopt them, in fact, baptize them and use them. Yeah. And I think most modern people don't default to that, so it's sort of, as it were, easier to allow when the patristics are talking about taking ideas than like us, like saying that there's truth in religion, right, because people are currently practicing them. But then on the flip side, I will say, even the concept of religions, so no one in the ancient world had that. Like this sociological category of like, oh, well, you're an American, but then you also have a religion. And, you know, so like religion is a sociological category. It can have truths or not. For most of human history, right, if you were to have a cultus is to belong to a particular group of people. Now, Christianity, right, as a universalizing religion, quote unquote, already starts to call that into big-time question. But, of course, even by the modern era, I mean, even with the Protestant, you know, rebellion, it would start to be, I belong to this prince, and therefore I have this religion, or otherwise I would have been ran off or martyred or whatever. And so it's only in the modern world, and really it's only a 19th century worldview, like since like Emil Durkheim and those sort of sociologists of religion, that you would even say, other religions have truth in them, and people would go, oh, you mean the Buddhists, oh, you mean the Hindus, oh, you mean the Jews. It just wouldn't be thought of that, right? Like nation and peoplehood and all of that was tied much more together. And so I think there's like a double, blindness is like too strong of a word, but certainly a double fog, Bud, that makes it hard for us to really get at, you know, we were talking about principles and how hard it is. Like we need to look for the principles of something. That's where I think there's a lot of confusions about the principles, because in one way, I'm with you completely. This document is just like, hey, if we believe Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus have things that we can take from them, even though they didn't worship the crucified one, certainly it could be the case that we could do that with someone from Hinduism, someone from Taoism. But we live in a world where Taoism is this sociological category called Taoism, which is just alien to the past, and something that I think we're still working through to talk about in the modern world.
Well, I like the Emil Durkheim reference. I feel like on the Uncommon Good, we could use a bingo sheet, and then our avid listeners, like Marshall McLuhan, would be the center of the bingo sheet, but someone's like, Emil Durkheim, I-9, you know.
A Durkheim reference.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
No, and that's where, on last week's show, I used the phrase time-bound, where Gaudium et Spes, there are parts of it that like have, like their shelf life has expired. And I hope no listeners were offended. Like, how dare he talk about
real
it?
Quick on that pause, too, just like to say that, too. Lateran IV has this, too, right? So
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's not just Vatican II that does this.
No, I mean, if you're listening, like, when's the last time you even read, like, the Council of Florence? There are council moments that have this kind of enduring category. Of course, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. I think some of us still, like, think about parts of Trent when we think about justification. But there are things that council said that, like, there's time-bound is the word I'm looking for. They're not quite as applicable or relevant or pressing for our time. I think when you think about Nostra aetate, as the document starts to walk through these other faith traditions, so it starts by affirming that the church rejects nothing of what is true about them, But then what it says tends to be sort of thin. So think about like the part on Hinduism. In Hinduism, people explore the divine mystery and express it both in the limitless riches of myth and the accurately defined insights of philosophy. They seek release from the trials of the present life by ascetical practices, profound meditation, and recourse to God and confidence in love. So just like a couple sentences, pretty brief. A Hindu might hear that and be like, yeah, that's true, but it doesn't really capture the essence or go into depth about my practice.
Can I say a mean comment rhetorically? That sounds like ChatGPT wrote that. So, and I mean this, I know this is shots fired, but this is where I'm getting what you're saying is, in order to talk about these things, it's not that that's not a caricature, and it's not rude,
right?
But it is like the most top level thing you can say. And so you start to go, well, how much can we take from these other religions if this is all we can say about them? I mean, I think that's a fair thing to say.
I think that's fair. And I think the bishops were trying to find common ground or build bridges. But this actually ties into another important point. So part of this document, of course, and I think as modern persons, I think this is sort of distinct of our culture, is we seek a kind of peace from people coming from different backgrounds. And the way this kind of cashes out, like in our time and place, is that a lot of folks think like liberalism can provide that. Not liberal political practices, but like liberal
Enlightenment liberalism
as an approach, as a philosophy. We can kind of like blend together. What's the bumper sticker? Coexist, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying the document's trying to do that. I do think the document's trying to find common ground. I'm saying, like, again, if you read this with college students today, that's sort of the place that their minds go. I know because I've tried, right? And but if you talk to historians of Christianity, or even like philosophers of religion and other folks who have studied these things throughout history, it's interesting because a lot of times when faith traditions that we think cannot get along or have a particularly difficult time doing so, it wasn't through sort of like a lowest common denominator interreligious dialogue, or sort of like can't we just all get along, like a kind of like fluffy sort of like downplaying of differences.
Right.
It was precisely through this like strong affirmation of like, this is where I'm coming from. I recognize this difference in you. That doesn't mean we have to kill each other. And all that I'm saying is like, I'm sort of questioning the way that some theologians extrapolate from this document that we sort of have to like downplay our differences, or, it's only if we all sign on to liberalism that we'll be able to get along. I think that approach actually, if you start talking about this with committed Hindus or Muslims, a lot of times it's sort of offensive because it doesn't feel them like you are taking seriously their own faith convictions. And what's funny is like that kind of like universalistic approach becomes a sort of like lowercase religion of its own, where the idea is like, well, you have to leave behind these things that potentially come into conflict with that dominant sort of like philosophy.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, getting into the particularities is where I've seen the most profit. I'm not getting into like exactly everything Father David Burrell says, or like vindicating like every argument he made, but I can tell you a very profitable dialogue with Shia Muslims, especially in Iran, talking about the apophatic tradition of both Shia and Catholicism. A lot of Thomas Aquinas, Wittgenstein that Burrell led with, and Shia scholars seeing where there were commonalities exactly because they were willing to get into sort of philosophical nitty-gritty. But I mean, to me, I know I'm a dirty philosopher, but I do think it's usually in the sort of philosophical background to a lot of the discussions that you might see much more profitability as well. Right. It's like being honest about the philosophical commitments, and like you said, not just trying to make a political coalition building.
I mean, some of the worst sort of manifestations of like the approach we're critiquing is I've seen religious services where like leaders have tried to blend different traditions, and what it ends up doing is sort of making a mockery of both.
Oh, it looks like a circus or a zoo.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is it. Like, okay, we'll get into this metaphor and pick it back up because it's very important. And so we're going to have a few more things to say about this document before we get into the other one. But yeah, keep that in mind, folks. We're going to talk about zoos. just for a little bit.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned on that one. So, Bud, one more time, just for everyone's, what's this document called in case they want to go read along with us?
Right, I know sometimes these council documents, like using the Latin, it's kind of foreign to us, but this one is called Nostra aetate. It's on the church's relationship to non-Christian religions. We'll also get into the decree on ecumenism. If you're taking notes at home, Unitatio, redintegratio.
This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. We're glad to have you with us. Imogene Ingredients, underwriting the show. Thank you for making it possible. This is the Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We're talking about religion and technology, subspecies. We're talking about the Vatican II documents in light of that lens. We've been talking about, Bud, same again, you're better at me.
Nostra aetate, so whenever we use the Latin phrase, it's the first couple words from the document. And so I mentioned the decree on ecumenism. I actually said it wrong at the end of that last segment. Unitatis, redintegratio, the restoration of unity. Nostra aetate is a little less glamorous. It just means in our day.
Yeah. And then that way it's more classical. Some of the older documents read like that. So, but I left off with saying I'm going to talk about zoos. So this is what I mean in this one. You were talking about worship services where they sort of parade out different representatives of different religions. Again, a concept that only really has existed the last 200 years at most. To sort of march them out and give us a flavor of your prayers and that. And so, but this is how liberal enlightenmentism, again, not political, liberal, conservative, liberal enlightenmentism, the liberal enlightenment views religions as you can have them, but they're really only good if they stay in their cage. Yeah. And so whenever we as quote unquote religions pull this number and go like, oh yeah, we'll all march out in our little circus and, you know, it's like, look, here's the lions, Christians, here's the Muslim elephants, right? So you always have to ask, who owns the zoo? Who's holding the circus, right? It's never the animals in the zoo or the circus. And one of the things that I know religions, quote unquote, whatever that means, don't want is to be viewed that way. And so the common course is almost always better, frankly, when the various religions are trying to steal from each other, like good ideas, like that shows that like we believe that there's a vitality to the spiritual life that the liberal enlightenment doesn't hold. This is why, you know, when talking about Christian mysticism, I often, you know, throw down part of the Tao Te Ching that says the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. That's one way to talk about, right, what Western mystics mean about apophaticism, for instance. And that's just a really like easy one that I've heard in multiple places, plagiarizing all sorts of people on that one. But I think that's not to say that Nostra aetate does this necessarily. This goes back to the immediate sort of interpretations after the council. I think with ease we can say the media and many people absolutely read it that way, even if the intent was to, like you said, do something controversial, which was the church in a church document admit that in the living religions of now, and not just the pagan past, there was truth that could be interacted with.
Yeah, this gets into... I don't want to go too deep into like literary theory, but the reception of a text becomes part of the meaning of the text. And if you've grown up in the church over the last several decades, you've seen this at play in spades where, I mean, we've used the phrase already, the spirit of Vatican II. That becomes kind of a nebulous concept that people project all sorts of ideas on. But certainly when it came to documents like this declaration on the church's relationship to non-Christian religions, folks run with that in all sorts of ways. I think the closest other comparison to that sort of reality is actually the renewal of religious life.
Yeah.
And you look at different religious orders and how they differently understand what it means to fulfill what Vatican II was calling, to recover their original charism. You see all sorts of expressions of that. Again, I just want to clarify, I'm not like signaling to a kind of relativism. I think the texts say what they say, and I think we could all do ourselves a service by being grounded like more deeply in the text, but it's just a reality of like historically what took place.
Absolutely. And shots fired. Let's be as postmodern as possible here. But I mean, and of course, not thinking all these theories are true, but two things, first of all, that are very medieval, A, and then B, set us at odds, what I think, with sort of Protestantism and anti-Protestantism, funny enough. So like you said, reception history. So like that, that's sort of a canonical studies thing. Sort of made its big debut in the 20th century academia. I mean, I just think it's undeniable to ask, an author can intend whatever they want, but how did this thing get accepted? But the other is reader response theory, which starts to be a bit more dynamic, which says the author writes in such a way knowing there is a possibility for different responses from the audience. And when you have a document, Bud, where there's contested groups co-writing documents, obviously reader response theory is at least a bit helpful, because you've pointed this out before, when you have different factions, and I know that we want to like romanticize and act like there's no factions in the church, but of course there's factions in a council. Even when they don't, so to speak, win the day or get to write the entire document, it's clear that they write stuff hoping, well, this is where the group I want will really latch onto this one part, and they'll respond in a certain way. And on one hand, it's not charitable to sort of like try to gainsay what anyone was intending. But I have to admit, this council, because of the sort of media environment in which it was immediately thrown, we were having big arguments about critical reception theory and reader response theory. Is what did the council intend? And in some ways, that's sort of gone with the wind, man. Like, we can read what various people, we have all sorts of documents about the various council fathers and what they thought they were doing, but this is out of their hands now. It really isn't their thing anymore. It belongs to the church, and to say the least, documents like this are contested.
Yeah. And all this ties into the other document that we're going to touch on today, the Decree on Ecumenism. This is another one where it's helpful to have some grasp of what's going on historically at the time. So what's called the ecumenical movement, which is a search among Christians to restore or attain a kind of unity, that takes off in the early part of the 20th century. I forget the exact, I think it was 1904. There's some massive ecumenical movement in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. And during that first half of the 20th century, the hierarchy, including popes, they speak out directly against Catholics participating in that movement. So you think back to, if you've ever talked to like older Catholic relatives and things, there was a time, and certainly today, I think this still involves prudential judgments, like where Catholics would not attend, say like one of their relatives was getting married in a Protestant church, you wouldn't attend that ceremony, or even in the case of funerals. More broadly speaking, when you think about something like the ecumenical movement, where there's these meetings under one roof of Christians from like Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist backgrounds, in some cases involving Eastern Orthodox, Catholics didn't participate. And the concern there was what we've already mentioned, indifferentism. By participating and engaging in those conversations, it could give the impression that the Catholic Church is one denomination among a constellation of denominations, which is what the Church has never confessed, of course. With this decree, Unitatis, redintegratio, there's actually not simply an invitation, but an encouragement in the document for Catholics to participate in the ecumenical movement. So the document starts with bemoaning the disunity that's arisen among Christians, and it uses like passages about Christ's prayer for, that all of his followers would be one, to say like this should be an impetus to overcome our differences. And then it goes through sort of like a theological understanding of how we relate to each other, despite the fact that we're divided at this level. And really it looks to baptism. So it says that baptism, like a valid baptism in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit with proper matter, it brings a person into real, though imperfect, communion with the Catholic Church. So if someone's baptized by a minister outside the Catholic Church, they have a real communion with the Church, even though they don't have the fullness of salvation that's made available only in the Church.
And just to speak out of the gate, there's ways in which this document had profound successes. I know that can get into, there's arguments anyone wants to make about anything. We happen to know very well, we had a professor, Jeffrey Wainwright, very involved with World Methodist and Catholic Dialogue, for instance. And you can go read some of the joint documents they made. And I'm not acting like it's we can argue about like the impact it made on the ground, but I don't think it's for nothing that the scholars got together and said these are the things in which, especially like on sanctification, weirdly enough, with the Methodists, or there's the joint declaration on justification with the Lutherans. Again, did that bring a whole groundswell of Lutherans into the church? No, but I think that like there were major obstacles that 100 years before that, there wouldn't have been that sort of concord.
Yeah.
The big one, of course, is the Anglican Rite. Why am I blanking on the very obvious?
The Ordinariate?
Yeah, I mean, that is clearly something that stems from this, and that is actively entire congregations sometimes coming into the Catholic Church. So, if you're measuring success by entire federations of churches reunifying with the Catholic Church, okay, maybe not. And certainly is there ways in which, like you said, the worries about indifferentism did sneak in? Absolutely. Yeah. But I do think this document specifically has had gains that I think every Catholic should be happy about.
Well, as Catholics and those of us who are called to the vocation of theology, to be a theologian, one mistake that we can make is to not recognize the truths that are shared within different traditions. So it would just be, it would just be like ethically, intellectually irresponsible to not recognize, like, well, there are things that we believe about God that are shared in common. That can very easily like tip over into a kind of indifferentism. The ecumenical movement has been, it seemed promising at times. It's challenging in the sense that, especially within certain Protestant denominations, the goalpost can shift.
Yeah.
And so like
they can become different types of goalposts.
Yeah, and yes. That's right. In the wake of the council, like the first decades after that, the conversations with Lutherans were very much about like the doctrine of justification. In our own day and age, like when we think about mainline Protestants, so Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, like the difficulties or obstacles have a lot more to do with things like women's ordination, our anthropologies, our understanding of like the sacrament of marriage. Those sorts of things have become almost like they feel like insurmountable obstacles. Like these denominations would have to backtrack significantly for us to have any sort of traction. And that's where that leads to a bigger point. And that is, and I think the document is clear on this, like the church as it's constituted by Christ, one holy Catholic and apostolic, that's the church founded by God, like instituted by God, and it's the ark of salvation. It's the ordinary means of salvation. And so when we talk about division among Christians, that describes a sort of like historical reality that's led to differences in understanding. But unity, qua unity, in and of itself is something possessed by the church here and now. Mm-hmm. And that's where I don't think you can, and this happens sometimes in like sort of like academic theology on these matters, you can't sort of like project unity as something to be achieved in the future.
Right.
You can talk about the healing or restoration of division, but I don't know, this is where I struggle. And I would say things like at a conference or something that some theologians would say, well, Bud's simply wrong. But when you get in, what I mean by that is when you get into the commentary on this document, mm-hmm. you get mainstream theologians who say the church went from an ecumenism of return that called for those outside the church to like return to the faith to something sort of different. But I don't know, even like as this has cashed out, like you mentioned the Anglican Ordinariate, I would call that an ecumenical success.
Yes.
It was serious about the conversations regarding some of the differences or like,
or what was worthy to keep and bring over.
The heritage of Christianity in England.
Yep.
But when something significant was achieved, it still had this like full communion with the church that had implications for both the faithful but also those with holy orders.
Absolutely. And so I'm mixing stuff up, but this is sort of callbacks, right? So it's was it Lumen Gentium that had the church
subsistent.
Yeah, so yeah. And then where does invincible ignorance get brought up? Is that not these documents? I thought it was.
I think Lumen Gentium talks more about invincible ignorance than Unitatis redintegratio.
But the callback is very obvious, right? Yes. Is that, so again, we have the hierarchy, Lumen Gentium is a constitution of the church, correct? Right. And this is a decree. Yeah, so this is a decree. And the idea, right, is to take higher principles and start working them out. So if we're going to talk about that the church subsists in the Catholic Church, that there is things like invincible ignorance. And again, I get, people will say, like, on both sides of groups that I don't want to agree with, they'll say, well, these were innovations. I think that these are ways to restate what was at least, I just think this is an organic development of doctrine. I'm going to be a Newmanite on this one. And that like Newman, I think we should be minimalist about these sort of things. You should never be maximalist about sort of development of doctrine. So clearly, if we thought like Emperor Trajan could be like resurrected from the dead to be baptized, like maybe we can talk about the seeds that are in other churches and things like this. So I completely am with you. I think everything in the church is about a theology of return, right? Like the prodigal son. We are a church of return. So I don't think the ecumenism of return's bad, but I converted, bud. Right. You and I converted, and so I do think personally that's one of the weirder curveballs I get thrown a lot. It's because I'm a convert. People think I really want to be involved in ecumenical considerations, and it's not that I don't believe that it's very important, but I swam the Tiber. I thought there were reasons to do so. And sure, I'm willing to think about all of the good things that like my parents gave me and about how they can reinvigorate, they can sort of like take root in the Catholic Church and in piety and things like this. But to read this, and this is another one where it really did fall to the magisterium of the new media at the time. People wanted it to say things that it didn't, and the things they wanted it to say just simply didn't cash out, I think is the right thing to say.
Yeah, well, to put flesh on these bones, I had to think about these things very personally and practically. So when I was learning about the Catholic faith, you mentioned Jeffrey Wainwright. I took a course with him called Does Doctrine Still Divide? And so I thought about ecumenism like as it applied to my own life and what role I might play in these conversations. Eventually I came to the point. And it was really, I think I mentioned this on the show a few weeks ago, but it was a line from Lumen Gentium said that if a person recognizes the church for who she claims to be and refuses to enter into it, he cannot be saved, right? Yeah. But even if you take it in a different key and you talk about the fullness of the gifts of salvation, the things that are uniquely preserved in the Catholic Church, I got to a point where I didn't want to envision my future life and see myself like involved even in a very like meaningful way in ecumenical dialogue and then dying outside of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And so like I felt compelled at some point, like I thought the most important thing that I could do for Christian unity is to submit to the church that Christ founded. And that's where, like we've already mentioned reception history, this moves away sort of like from the text and its concreteness to how it's been understood and applied. Mm-hmm. But I've talked to friends who, so as someone who studied at a divinity school, I have friends who, studied to be ministers or ended up being Protestant ministers. And, for some of them as like, well, and I'm thinking of a specific conversation when he went to a Catholic priest and said, I've been learning about the Catholic faith. I'm thinking of becoming a member of the church. The priest said to him, like, the best thing that you can do is to be like the best sort of Presbyterian pastor that you can be. And I think that's just misguided. It doesn't take seriously even the content of this document, where when you get into the nuts and bolts of like the differences between the different traditions, what you'll notice is when the document talks about Protestantism, it's very careful. It's kind of funny because at one point there's a sentence that says like, it's sort of like difficult to describe these traditions because, it's so like variegated and diverse. And then it says like, it's very careful in saying like, God has not refrained from using these communities to bring people to salvation. When it gets to Eastern Orthodoxy, it's much more robust and specific, saying they've preserved apostolic succession and therefore have a valid Eucharist. So it's not, to me, it's not a lowest common denominator. No. In fact, when it gets into the nuts and bolts, it's willing to say there are these distinct differences that remain important, such that our relationship to the Orthodox is different than our relationship to Protestants.
Well, I mean, I think this gets back to the relationship with the Jewish people compared to other religions. That's sort of mirrored in the other document as well, as whatever else we want to say about the practicalities and the great sadness and misery of how history has played out. The Jews are still the elder brothers of the same covenantal design, which is different than saying like what other truths might be in other religions. And here, the Eastern Orthodox are separated brethren. Protestantism is ecumenical communities, or I forget how they put it, ecclesial communities. Right. And but the thing that I'll throw out to add a personal element to this as well is people who talk about that there's an ecumenism of like restoration or something like this. this says this is document about the unity of Christians. I'm sorry if this sounds mean. There's not unity outside of of Catholicism. Mm-hmm. If you remain in the ecumenical discussions, but not within the Catholic Church, it's an accretion of ecclesiastical communities at best. Mm-hmm. But there's not the unity that people are talking about. And I think the fact that Rome continues to play a role even when people don't really want it to, because they have various reasons why they want to do that, people know that unity is really important. And apostolic succession is one of those unities, which is why the Eastern Orthodox have it in a particular way compared to everyone else. But as much as as this document says, I know that there are faithful, that faith really does exist in the ecclesiastical communities outside of the Catholic Church, but that unity is not there. And that might be mean, but I think that what has to guide the reading of that document is, where is there a possibility for unity?
Well, church history carries on, it goes forward. And I don't want to sound too pedantic about this, but Nostra aetate and Unitatis redintegratio weren't the final word on these matters. You think about raising children. So, children can be very clever in their application of directives that you give them. So you may say to your 7-year-old son, don't cross the street. I don't want you to cross the street here. And then you go to a friend's house and you see him running through the street and you're like, what are you doing? He's like, well, you told me not to cross the street, but so I thought you were referring only to 70th Street, or I can stay in the street for an extended period of time.
Right.
And I guess the way I'm trying to apply that to church teaching is you saw with these documents that they said what they said, folks applied them in certain ways, and at times the church has had to come back and say more and even correct misunderstandings.
Dominus Jesus.
Dominus Jesus, year 2000. There are Catholic theologians who are questioning the unicity of the church, meaning the fact that it is one and it has a unique role in salvation. They're even in places we have theologians who are casting doubt on the significance of Christ, sort of presenting him as a spiritual teacher and not as the Son of God, consubstantial with the Father. And the church comes in and says no, it doesn't harp on it throughout the document, but it's clearly sort of a response to misapplications of these documents. And so that kind of task going forward is a perennial one, and it's not only at the highest levels of the church, but if you've ever taught CCD or a theology class, this comes up all the time.
Yeah. I realize that after we get done with Vatican II documents, we're going to have to hit important post-Vatican II documents like Dominus Jesus, read in the Religion and Technology lens. But an amazing miracle, we covered 2 documents in one episode. Where
we're more efficient than bishops.
I was going to say, we've been at a clip of doing we've probably averaged, 3 episodes per document?
No, it's been kind of fun. There's been so much written about Vatican II, but I liked the lens that you suggested for talking about these, and I think we have hopefully provided something important for folks to think about.
So one more time, Bud, just if people want to, if they're prone to go read what we talked about, what are the 2 documents again?
Yeah, speaking of the development of media, the Vatican's actually recently revised its website. For those of us who've been reading it for a long time, I'm sort of nostalgic for the past, but it is a better aesthetic UI, these days, easier to read. You can go there to find Nostra aetate on the Church's relationship to other religions, or Unitatis redintegratio, the decree on ecumenism, to read more about these topics.
Absolutely. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for making this possible. This is The Uncommon Good. Stick around. We'll be right back after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you to Imogene Ingredients. Like we've said before, you make this show possible, and we are very, very grateful. We hope you've enjoyed the show. As talked about before, this has been us wrapping up our conversation on Gaudium et Spes. We will, of course, move on to consider more Vatican II documents in light of religion and technology. We'll keep trucking along, as it were. Bud, great show. How can people join us with our prayer life here on Iowa Catholic Radio?
So please do join us in our prayer life. You can go to iowacatholicradio.com and click on the program schedule. That will have all of our great talk shows and things, but also a schedule of the prayer life here on the radio station.
In a similar way, if you want to see what's going on in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com, click on the Iowa Catholic Radio events, and you'll get to see all sorts of wonderful things, how you can join in on the fun that's happening in the listening area. And folks, remember that this Ministries. It's not just the people on the mics, behind the boards, or behind the desks. It's your ministry as well. You make it possible with your prayers, with your volunteer hours, but very much so with your donation. So please make sure to consider donating to Iowa Catholic Radio by going to iowacatholicradio.com and hitting the donate button, or you can go call 515-223-1150, call or text 515-223-1150 to donate. Bud, great show as always.
For sure. Thanks, Bo.
This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.